In 1891, the British Army's newest rifle began destroying itself from the inside. 3 years earlier, in 1888, that same rifle had been hailed as a triumph. A marriage of a Scottish-American inventor's bolt action and an English engineer's precision rifling. Now cordite was eating through its barrel groove by groove, round by round. The very feature that made the rifle famous was the first thing the Army had to tear out and replace. 10 years later, the soldiers who carried it into Sudan and the Boer War were carrying a rifle bearing almost none of its original name. But the real story of the Lee-Metford is not a failure of engineering. It is the story of how a rifle can be right for exactly the wrong amount of time, precise enough to solve yesterday's problem, obsolete before it could outlive its own decade. Every week, we tell the stories of the engineers, the arsenals, and the decisions that built or erased the world's most important military small arms. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Enfield Lock, Middlesex, 1888. Enfield Lock, Middlesex, 1888. 15 miles north of London, on the banks of the River Lee, the Royal Small Arms Factory had been turning out British service rifles since 1816. It was not a private workshop. It was a state institution, and the rifle it was about to adopt carried the fingerprints of two men who had never worked in the same room until the War Office brought them together. James Paris Lee was born in Howick, Scotland, in 1831, the son of a watchmaker. A watchmaker's trade demands a particular kind of patience. Tiny tolerances, moving parts that must engage in exact sequence, failure measured in fractions of a millimeter. Lee's family emigrated to Canada when he was 5, and it was there, tinkering with firearms as a young man with no formal engineering education, that he began filing patents. By the 1860s, he was in the United States, and by 1879 he had designed the mechanism that would define his name in military history. A bolt action, a manually operated steel bolt that locks a cartridge into the chamber by rotating and pulling rearward, then strips a fresh round forward on the return stroke, paired with a detachable box magazine, a spring-loaded steel container holding multiple cartridges that feeds them upward into the action, allowing a soldier to reload in seconds rather than one round at a time. Before Lee's design, most military rifles fed a single cartridge by hand or relied on fixed tube magazines that were slow to reload under fire. British ordnance trials in the early 1880s had tested dozens of competing bolt actions and magazine systems, and none solved both problems, smoothness of cycling and speed of reloading, as cleanly as Lee's. The War Office adopted the Lee action in 1888, but an action alone does not make a rifle. It needs a barrel. That barrel came from William Ellis Metford, born in 1824 in Fluke House, Taunton, the son of a wine merchant. Metford trained as a civil engineer and spent much of his working life on railway construction in India and England, a career with no obvious connection to firearms. His passion for target shooting, pursued as an amateur at a time when precision rifle competition was a respected English pastime, led him into years of private experimentation with rifling. The spiral grooves cut into the inside of a barrel that spin a bullet for stable flight. Metford's innovation was shallow, rounded rifling grooves, a profile designed specifically to resist the thick, corrosive fouling left behind by black powder, the propellant used in every military cartridge of the era. Where competing barrel designs clogged and lost accuracy after a few dozen rounds of black powder residue, Metford's rifling stayed cleaner, longer. The two men never co-designed anything together. The War Office matched them. Lee's action, tested and approved separately, married to Metford's barrel, tested and approved separately, in a joint trial that produced the rifle, magazine, Lee-Metford, Mark I. Records suggest the initial Enfield lock production order called for several thousand rifles in the first year, manufactured alongside the older Martini Henry single-shot rifles still in reserve stores. The caliber was .303 inches, a new smokeless-era cartridge in name only, because in 1888, cordite did not yet exist. The rifle was built for a black powder world that had, at that exact moment, only 3 years left to live. The Lee-Metford that reached troops in 1888 was a bolt-action repeating rifle chambered for the .303-inch cartridge. A rimmed brass case holding a black powder charge and a lead-cored bullet, small enough in caliber that soldiers at the time still called larger bore rifles the real weapons of war. The bolt, a steel cylinder locked into the receiver by 2 lugs that rotate into recesses in the action body, was turned up, drawn back, and pushed forward by hand for every shot, feeding a fresh round from an 8-round detachable box magazine slotted beneath the action. Metford's shallow rifling gave the rifle a reputation for accuracy that outlasted a day of firing without the barrel choking on fouling. The price was not set by a shop counter. It was set by a parliamentary defense estimate. The Lee-Metford was a government-owned design, manufactured at state expense at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield Lock, and under contract at the London Small Arms Company. By one account, unit production cost ran to several pounds per rifle at a time when a British infantry private earned roughly a shilling a day, a rifle representing several months of a soldier's pay, though the soldier himself never paid a penny of it. Go to market for a state arm meant one customer, the War Office, and through it the entire regular British Army and the auxiliary forces of empire. There were no trade catalogues, no export agents in Hamburg. There was a single acquisition authority and a single decision in 1888 that determined the rifle's fate more completely than any market ever could. The patent moat here was not commercial, it was institutional. Lee's action patents controlled the mechanism. The War Office's exclusive procurement authority meant no domestic competitor could simply out-manufacture the design into the marketplace, and no foreign rifle could enter British service without a fresh trials process the Ordnance Board rarely permitted. The moat was not paperwork, it was the uniform. Early adoption was total and immediate by institutional standards. The Lee-Metford Mark I entered British Army service in 1888, followed by the Mark II with a 10-round magazine in 1892. It armed regular infantry battalions across the United Kingdom, went into colonial garrisons in India, and equipped Royal Navy landing parties. By the early 1890s, several 100,000 rifles had left the Enfield Lock and London Small Arms Company production lines. Records suggest total Lee-Metford production across all marks reached somewhere near 2 million rifles before manufacture shifted entirely to its successor. The rifle's first sustained combat test came quickly. Colonial columns carried it into the Chitral expedition of 1895 on the northwest frontier of India, and into the early Sudan campaigns that would culminate at Omdurman in 1898. It performed exactly as Lee and Metford had built it to perform: smooth cycling, reliable feeding, accurate at range, clean shooting against black powder fouling. The timing was almost too precise. In 1889, the year after adoption, chemists at the Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey were already deep into trials of a new smokeless propellant. By 1893, the Lee-Metford was not one rifle. It was an institution wearing a single name across an empire that spanned 6 continents. The list of hands that carried it tells the story better than any production figure. Regular infantry battalions of the British Army carried it in home garrisons from Aldershot to Colchester. The Indian Army's British Officer Corps issued it to frontier regiments along the northwest frontier, where Chitral's relief column carried it through mountain passes in 1895. Royal Marine landing parties carried it ashore from Royal Navy warships on colonial policing duties from the Mediterranean to the China Station. Volunteer Rifle Corps, part-time citizen soldiers training on weekends across English and Scottish counties, drilled with it as their first taste of a modern repeating rifle. By 1896, colonial constabularies in parts of British Africa had begun receiving surplus stock as newer marks entered regular service. And in 1898, at Omdurman. It went into the largest set-piece battle the British Army would fight in Africa that decade. A battle later remembered for the rifle that replaced it, though the Lee-Metford was still in the ranks that day. Production scaled to match. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock and the London Small Arms Company together turned out several 100,000 rifles across the Mark I and Mark II variants between 1888 and the mid-1890s, with the workforce at Enfield Lock numbering in the low thousands at peak output. The factory itself sprawled along the River Lee, its machine shops running government contracts on a scale no private British gunmaker of the era could match. The wartime segment here does not arrive as a single mobilization order. It arrives as a slow-motion collision between chemistry and steel. In 1889, the year after the Lee-Metford entered service, chemists at the Royal Gunpowder Mills, Waltham Abbey, under the direction of Sir Frederick Abel and Sir James Dewar, perfected cordite, a smokeless propellant made from nitroglycerin, gun cotton, and mineral jelly, extruded into cord-like strands that burned cleaner and hotter than black powder and drove a bullet to far higher velocity. The War Office adopted cordite for the .303 cartridge in 1891. What the factory had been producing, a black powder-era rifle barrel, shallow-grooved to resist a fouling problem cordite did not have, was suddenly being asked to survive a propellant it was never designed to survive. Cordite burned hotter than black powder ever had, and that heat, combined with the friction of a bullet gripping shallow rifling at higher velocity, began eroding Metford's grooves within a few thousand rounds. By one account, some barrels showed measurable throat erosion in under 5,000 rounds of sustained cordite fire, a fraction of the service life expected of a black powder barrel. The human dimension here belongs not to soldiers enlisting for war, but to armorers and ordnance officers watching barrels wear out in peacetime trials faster than any rifle in living memory. Workshop fitters at Enfield Lock, trained for a decade on black powder tolerances, found themselves measuring bore wear on a timescale no one had built the inspection routines for. The stakes sentence belongs to the frontier, not the trench. If a Lee-Metford's rifling wore smooth after a few thousand rounds of cordite fire on the northwest frontier, a soldier depending on aimed fire at 300 yards lost the accuracy his training assumed he had at the exact range colonial skirmishes were fought. One specific deployment scene closes the arc. At Omdurman on the 2nd of September, 1898, British infantry squares held rifle fire against Mahdist forces at ranges the Lee-Metford's sights were calibrated for, the last major battle where the name Metford still appeared on the barrel of a rifle in general British Army service, even as the Ordnance Board back in London had already approved its replacement barrel profile the year before. There was no medal for the rifle, no War Department citation. Its recognition was quieter and more bureaucratic. A Mark I asterisk modification in 1892, a Mark II in the same year with a 10-round magazine, refinements chasing a problem the rifle's fundamental barrel geometry could not fix. Lee himself, by the 1890s, had moved on to consulting work in the United States, his bolt action already being adopted and adapted by other nations' small arms boards. Metford did not live to see the full extent of what replaced his rifling. He died in 1899, the same year the Second Boer War began, a war fought almost entirely with a rifle that no longer bore his name. The turning point was not a battle. It was a memorandum. In 1895, the Ordnance Board formally approved a new barrel profile for the .303 rifle. Deeper, square-shouldered rifling designed at the Royal Small Arms Factory's own drawing office, engineered specifically to withstand cordite's heat and pressure rather than resist black powder fouling that no longer mattered. The design bore the factory's name. It was called the Enfield pattern. Under pressure, nothing was defended. No campaign was launched to save Metford's rifling. No modification program tried to reinforce the shallow grooves against cordite wear. There was no institutional loyalty to preserve. This was government ordnance, not a private firm with a brand to protect. The War Office had adopted Lee's action and Metford's barrel as two separable components in 1888, and in 1895 it simply replaced the one that had failed, with the same administrative indifference it had used to combine them in the first place. The structural threat here was singular and total. A chemical revolution that arrived 4 years after adoption and rendered the barrel's core design principle obsolete before a full generation of soldiers had cycled through service with it. There was no foreign competitor undercutting price. There was no leveraged buyout, no private equity extraction, no bankruptcy filing. Because there was no company to extract from, the rifle belonged to the Crown, and the Crown simply moved on. The transition arrived not as collapse, but as quiet substitution. In 1895, the rifle, magazine, Lee-Enfield, Mark I entered production. Lee's action, unchanged in principle, married now to the new deep Enfield rifling. Existing Lee-Metford rifles already in armory stores were, in many cases, rebarreled rather than scrapped, the receivers and bolts too valuable to discard, the barrels too compromised to keep. Records suggest large numbers of Mark II Lee-Metfords were converted to Lee-Enfield configuration through the later 1890s, the old name disappearing from the barrel while the rest of the rifle carried on in service. Workforce and factory felt almost nothing of this. Enfield Lock did not close. It did not shed workers. The same machinists who had bored Metford's shallow grooves were retrained within months to cut Enfield's deeper rifling on the same lathes, in the same sheds, under the same roof. This was not an industrial collapse. It was a specification change absorbed entirely within a single state arsenal, invisible to anyone outside the Ordnance Board's own paperwork. By 1899, when the Second Boer War began, the rifle British soldiers carried into the veldt bore a different name entirely. The Metford name went first from new production, then from the Ordnance Board's own catalogues, then from official Army terminology. Surviving rifles were called Lee-Metfords a little longer by soldiers who had trained on them. Then even that stopped. The receiver still said Enfield, and the receiver was all anyone read. The Enfield receiver survived. The Metford name did not. By 1903, the Lee-Enfield had been redesigned again. Shorter, handier, standardized across infantry and cavalry alike as the short magazine Lee-Enfield, the rifle that would carry the British Army through 2 world wars and remain in Commonwealth service into the 1950s and beyond in some theaters. The Lee action Lee had patented in 1879 was still there, unbroken, underneath a barrel Metford never designed. No company relaunched the Metford name. No collector brand revived it as a marketing label. There was nothing to revive. A government arsenal does not resurrect a discontinued pattern. The silence is the story. Original Lee-Metfords survive today almost entirely in institutional and collector hands. Rock Island Auction Company has brought Mark I and Mark II examples to sale in recent decades, typically fetching modest sums against Lee-Enfields of later marks, a reflection of the Metford's shorter production run and lower survival numbers with original barrels intact since so many were rebarreled in service. The Pattern Room collection, now held by the Royal Armouries, retains reference examples of every mark. British and Commonwealth militaria collector societies distinguish Lee-Metfords from Lee-Enfields carefully, precisely because so few original Metford rifled barrels survive unmodified. Most were bored out or replaced during the very transition described here. Why the original still matters is narrow but real. A Lee-Metford, with its original Metford barrel intact, is one of the few surviving physical records of what British Army rifling looked like in the last years before smokeless powder, a snapshot of an engineering solution built for a chemical problem that stopped existing within a decade. Arms historians studying black powder-era barrel design have almost nowhere else to look. The Royal Small Arms Factory itself still stands at Enfield Lock, though rifle production there ended in the 1980s, and the site today houses a museum trust and residential development built around the preserved factory buildings. The machine shops that once bored Metford's shallow grooves converted into heritage-listed structures rather than demolished outright. The surprise footnote belongs to Lee, not Metford. James Paris. Lee never saw his action reach its full institutional lifespan. He died in 1904 in California, having spent his final years consulting for American arms makers, including early work connected to the Winchester and Remington Lee rifle programs. Entirely separate from the empire, his bolt action would go on to arm for the next 60 years. The man whose name the rifle kept never fully witnessed how completely it would outlast him. What the Lee-Metford represents is not a failure of engineering. It is what happens when a precise solution to yesterday's problem meets a chemical revolution nobody could have timed for. Metford solved black powder fouling as well as it could be solved. Cordite made that solution irrelevant within 4 years, through no fault of the man who built it. Military procurement, unlike a private firm, has no obligation to preserve a name once the specification changes. It preserves function and lets the label fall away. What a design office loses when it loses a name like Metford's is not capacity. It is a form of specific, hard-won technical memory that took years to accumulate and vanished from public record almost as fast as it arrived. Somewhere in a Royal Armoury's storeroom, a Lee-Metford Mark II still sits with its original barrel, its shallow Metford grooves worn smooth by decades-old cordite rounds fired long before anyone in that room was born, the bolt still cycling as cleanly as it did the day it left Enfield lock. The rifle that replaced it would go on to fight 2 world wars under a different name. See you in the next one.